During my year-long hiatus from Yu-Gi-Oh!, I spent most of my time in nature, honing my skills as a landscape photographer. This time away not only helped me to grow the business side of things, but I also learned a lot about myself in the process. Along the way, I visited some of my favorite local state parks and preserves, witnessed incredible things, made new friends and connections, and took amazing photographs. I also had my work featured in a few galleries, attended a few art shows, and I even won an award in the process. And on top of everything else, I even wrote and published my own book documenting my travels throughout 2024. During my absence, I realized that being a landscape photographer and visual storyteller was my true calling. While I love everything about this new chapter in my life, it doesn't change the fact that landscape photography can and will leave one feeling isolated at times. This isolation left me with many quiet moments, allowing me to reflect on things. In doing so, I would look back upon my time here on YouTube, which reminded me more and more of a special part of my life that I had left on hold. A part in which I spent many years making quality friends and great memories. I believe those friends and memories ultimately made me want to return. Initially, I thought that returning to Yu-Gi-Oh! Meant my work as a photographer would suffer, and that any progress I made would go to waste, as if I had spent the entire year walking in one giant circle. I came to understand that this was flawed thinking though. My time spent conversing with and studying nature allowed me to grow into a better version of myself, which gave me a newfound confidence in myself and my ability to balance my passions and produce quality work in both fields. I am so excited to take on this new journey with a fresh perspective, and I look forward to seeing what the future holds. Man, it feels really good to be doing this again. One of the first decisions I had to make when it came to playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Again was deciding what deck to play. And having seen so many of my favorite decks receive new support during my hiatus meant this was going to be a more complicated decision than I anticipated. As many of you know, I thought I'd be returning with Photon Galaxy with the release of the new Tachyon cards, but the release date wasn't lining up with my plans to return, so I had to look elsewhere. Amongst the decks I had played in the past that had received new cards, Speedroid felt like the perfect deck to return with. Doing so would offer me a chance to pick up where I left off, while also allowing me the chance to redeem an all-time favorite deck of mine that had came to a brutal end with the banning of Baron DeFleur back in April. The new Speedroid cards from Supreme Darkness really helped to breathe new life into the strategy. While these cards still leave a lot to be desired when comparing to the Cashier build, that doesn't mean these new cards aren't excellent. The new boss monster over Synchro Dragon is crazy and probably the closest thing we'll ever get to Baron DeFleur. Glider number 2 is also a much needed extender that helps us to easily access OSD, while serving as an interruption in the graveyard for Synchro and Ixtie's base strategies. Colonel Clackers has also got to be one of the craziest pieces of support this deck has received in a long time. It gives us easy access to Wing Synchron for further play extension and allows us to grab Marble Machine to take advantage of the pendulum mechanic. Wing Synchron being able to summon Clearwing Synchro Dragon essentially for free while also being able to send key cards to the graveyard like Duplicate and Wonder is also very good. Last but not least, Speedroid Clearwing Wonder serves as a great piece of interruption on field, while also allowing us to reset soft once per turn effects like OSD and Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon with its graveyard effect, essentially doubling the interruptions our boss monsters can produce. These cards may not fix all of Speedroid's problems, but they definitely have made the deck much more enjoyable to play after its tragic downfall. And so it was settled. Speedroid would be my deck of choice, and that meant it was time to start building the deck, and most importantly, hopping on Dueling Book to test it against some friends. Also, I'd like to take a quick moment here to give a big shout out to the Speedroid Discord server, Cross Souls, for helping me familiarize myself with the new combos. Their website, which you can find a link to in the description, was super helpful, so big shout out to those guys. My first match back was against Malice, and playing against that deck after a year-long break while also having to deal with Fool Loss was nothing short of a nightmare. However, after much trial and error, I was getting the hang of things Speedroid-wise. The combos felt great, and the end boards weren't half bad. I began to accept the fact that the Malice matchup would probably always be unwinnable for this deck, especially if I couldn't draw Lancia, which happened quite a bit. I mean, seriously, I probably played my friend Dan on Malice maybe 10-15 times and lost every single one. Moving on, I began to play against the Ryziel Fiendsmith deck. While no doubt a challenging matchup, I felt much more confident against that deck as it was easier to interact with, and the Speedroid endboard often excelled at shutting off the Ryziel engine with Glider number 2 alone. From there, I played against other decks like Blue Eyes, Sword Soul, and Tearlament. To my surprise, the deck performed well against most of these strategies. Most notably, the Blue Eyes matchup was another solid opponent for Speedroid. Glider being able to disrupt their synchro and link plays was beneficial, and the end board that the Blue Eyes deck put up felt manageable for the Speedroid engine, especially with a hand trap or two. Primite Drill Beam was by far one of the most frustrating cards to deal with, and while we're on the subject of frustrating cards, Fool Loss and Dominus Impulse were always a thorn in the side for this deck. I still can't believe that card was even printed, as it is so powerful. Your Cork Shooter and your Wing Synchrons are just never resolving. On top of all these external problems, I noticed quite a few internal problems for the Speedroid deck. First and foremost, the deck could no longer seamlessly play Fukimadoshi Piper, which was a massive hit for consistency. Second, even with the new cards, Speedroid still lacks a solid pool of good starter cards. Terror Top coming back to 3 certainly made this less of an issue, but with no Cashier engine to bridge you into your Speedroid cards, I couldn't help but feel like I was bricking more often. To remedy this, I added in what I think is the best Rhoda the deck can play, Small World. I think it's far better than its alternatives, Win and Scratch. Furthermore, the deck also seemed far more fragile towards interruptions and hand traps. In the past, the Cashier engine and Barone would help you to play past these interruptions and make them less impactful. Now, being left without those, each hand trap felt twice as bad. Initially, I added Crossout Designator into the main deck to help combat excessive hand traps from my opponent, and it worked out for the most part. It even synergized with Small World since I was already playing a diverse pool of hand traps myself. As time went on, I began to realize that Crossout was probably best left in the side deck, which ultimately opened up more room in the main deck for, you guessed it, more hand traps. Lastly, the age-old issue of having too many bricks in the main deck was more annoying now than ever. At first, I played both Duplicate and Speedroid Clearwing Wonder, and while these cards serve important purposes on their own, they are undoubtedly terrible to draw in most cases. Having moved away from Hound and Duplicate altogether, I decided to add in my good old friend Tetherwolf. This card is Hound without the main deck engine requirement while still being a one-card rubber band shooter. Though I still like the theory behind playing Hound, as Hound can also be a one-card Cork Shooter, give you additional options with rubber band shooter, while offering some follow-up in the graveyard. All these things crossed my mind while building the deck, but in the end, Tetherwolf proved best as it helps the overall consistency of the deck, which I think is by far the most important thing to consider. With all my testing completed, I was finally ready to head to locals and test the deck in a tournament/competitive setting. If I'm being honest, I was pretty nervous about attending as it had been more than a year since I played in a locals last, and on top of that, I'd be playing in a brand new store. First Yu-Gi-Oh tournament in over a year was rough, to say the least. However, I managed my expectations and went into the tournament with the mindset that I was strictly there to learn and enjoy myself, even though I'd probably be losing games left and right. My first hand was a near brick that ended with an Ash Blossom. I find it funny that my first turn went that way, but it is what it is, and I went on to win the match. The next round was against Malice, and you already know how I feel about that matchup. To make matters worse, I was met with a D-shifter in games 1 and 2 with no answer. Somehow I pulled through in game 2, but lost the match in a grindy game 3. In round 3, I played against what I thought would be a rather unlikely and not real deck, but it actually turned out to be a very real matchup for me anyways. Ended up being the Sprite deck. In game 1, I completely bricked, and in game 2, I misplayed, missing a line to OSD, and to make matters worse, I got slapped with a Dark Ruler, and then my board completely broken with no way to recover. The final round was against my friend Dan on Malice. We both opened pretty subpar in game 1, but ultimately I lost the hand trap war and couldn't recover. Game 2 was similar, as I was hit with double Fua and Impermanence to seal the deal. And as you can see, the inconsistency issues and inability to deal with hand traps that showed up in testing also showed up here at locals. So moving forward, I would continue trying to find ways to mitigate these issues as much as possible. Let's fast forward 1 week to my second locals with the deck. First off, I should mention a crucial mistake I made before the tournament even began, and that was the fact that I forgot my Tether Wolves at home. I know, a rookie mistake. Luckily, I had Small World in my deck at 2 copies, allowing me to keep a decent number of starter cards. I was also able to borrow 2 copies of Perulia this time around. I owe a big shout out to my friends Dan and Adam for lending me some much needed cards. Let's hop into round 1 where I played against Malice. Guess what happened? I lost. Oh. The game is over before it starts. I know, right? Shocking. So let's move on to round 2 where I played against an old favorite of mine, Mermail. I've been reading a lot of the new cards lately and I can't believe how good they are. Let's just say I was hoping to win the die roll. And while that didn't happen, my opponent was the one who bricked and had to pass completely. He had Perulia, which I was able to ash, though this meant his Fua went unanswered. Thankfully for me, I was able to pull off an OTK regardless. Game 2, Perulia was my saving grace, and despite getting hit with Moulin Glacia, I was able to Ogre his Anemone and stop the rest of the combo. Unfortunately, my follow-up was too weak and he was able to come back and seal the deal. In Game 3, Small World came in clutch to turn a Nibiru into Terror Top through Perulia. My opponent later had a Valor for Cork and Impulse for Wing. Alas, I lost. Moving on to round 3, I played against another deck I wasn't expecting, Salamangreat. In game 1, my opponent bricked and set 2 cards. I opened great, especially since Small World forced an Ash. Despite getting hit with Imperm and Nib, I was able to find a way to OSD and take the game. Game 2, my opponent did full combo and pulled off an insane end board I wasn't breaking. In the final game, I went first and opened a very solid hand with Crossout to insulate from one hand trap. My end board was double OSD with Wandering Grave, and while I may have misused my interrupts, I was able to win. In the 4th and final round, I played against a wild Crystal Beast deck. Game 1, I opened a solid hand that landed me on a board of Crystal Wing and OSD with Wandering Graveyard, ultimately allowing me to take the game. Game 2, my opponent ended on one of the craziest boards I've seen in a while. Though I definitely messed up when it came to using my 3 hand traps, and as a result, he was able to take the game no problem. In the last game, I went first and was hit with an early droll, but I was so fortunate to open all the necessary combo pieces I needed to end on a great board of Crystal Wing and OSD, allowing me to take the match. Overall, we had a better result than last week, but of course, there's still always room for improvement. As we head into the final locals I played with the deck, I made a change in the starter lineup by cutting Tetherwolf for Hound. Now I know earlier I said I like Tetherwolf a lot more than Hound for a few reasons, but I couldn't help myself from testing it out at locals at least once. With all of that being said, let's hop into the matches. Round 1 I played against Mimighoul, which is a rather infuriating deck I only ran into once on the YG Omega ladder before. Game 1, I lost outright and decided to take my chances with going first in Game 2. Unfortunately for me, my opponent had both Fua and Perulia in Game 2. I did have Crossout in hand, but unfortunately I did not have Fua in my main deck. Ideally I would have had it, but I just couldn't get my hands on that card before any of the tournaments I attended with the deck. Interestingly enough, despite my opponent drawing an astronomical amount of cards, he still had a pretty hard time breaking the board, but eventually the board was broken. My follow-up after the fact wasn't too good. Though Colonel Clackers allowing me to set up pendulum scales did give me access to Kite Drake, but it just ultimately wasn't enough. And the Hound in Graveyard was kind of awkward, as all it allowed me to do was bring out a Hagoita, which really didn't get me anywhere. So I guess that's points against Hound, especially since my extra deck really just wasn't built for that card anyways. Round 2 I played against Malice, and instead of skipping over this match entirely, let's talk about some of the good things that happened. In game 1, despite getting hit with Shifter, Ash Blossom, and Nibiru, my opponent's poor draws led me to an unexpected game 1 victory. Now, this is where things get rough. In game 2, I lost fair and square, as one Imperm was nowhere near enough to stop him. Game 3, my opponent had Droll and Ash, and while I probably could have done a better job at playing around it, the Ash on top of it is what sealed the deal. In round 3, I played against Kashtira, and if I'm being honest, my opponent was relatively new to the deck and to Yu-Gi-Oh!, so I had a pretty easy time taking the match. And outside of that, there really is nothing else of note to talk about. The deck performed well, and did a good job at dealing with the Cash End board and putting up boards to stop the Cash Engine. In the last round, I played against the same Murmril player I had 2 weeks prior. I lost the die roll again, but my opponent didn't brick this time and went full combo through my one-hand trap. Game 2 I led with Hound to get my plays started and ended on OSD with a set D barrier through Veiler and Imperm. The D barrier did wonders in slowing him down, but he was still able to clear OSD with an infantry, allowing me to tag into a copy of Crystal Clearwing. He had no cards left in hand, and I was top decking. Luckily, I ripped into a Marble Machine, but my opponent's Abyss Rhine in the draw phase drew him into an Effect Veiler, which was crazy to shut down my only valuable play. I know I had Hound in Graveyard at this point, but my failure to tech out the extra deck with cards that make Hound's Graveyard effect more valuable left me with little to no plays. Plus, I used Glider in Graveyard when I did not need to because I had already used D-Barrier on my opponent, and that cost me big time. Overall, this was a valuable lesson for me, as I now understand that I probably should have been playing a second rubber band shooter, as follow-up has always seemed worse without it, and Win just wasn't putting in the work I thought it would. I also wish I was playing Clearwing Rider, as I would have been able to clear my opponent's board, or at least force the Veiler to allow my Marble Machine to walk. All of these experiences allowed me to mold the deck into what I feel is the best version I could come up with. So, with that being said, let's hop into the deck profile.
You have that 1 hour.
Oh, that'd be a jacket.
You probably be good.
The sandwich guy? The yellow one, he's always making sandwiches.
Oh, yeah.
That's my favorite one. Queen Elamina. Gas queen.
I love that.
Q-Star barrel.
Q-Star what?
Barrel. Pull me owls and sell it to me.
Cursed me.
It's open.
Alright, I'm gonna go.
I'm giving you the opportunity to
Goodbye.
save yourself some money.
Get one of these out. Yeah, we gotta redo that.
Redo that shit.
That's good enough.
Alright, goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Welcome to the deck profile segment of the video, everybody. I'm sure this is the moment you've all been waiting for. So without further ado, let's take a look at what my current and sort of finalized Speedroid deck list looks like here for February/March of 2025. So as you can see here, I've got all of the Speedroid monsters laid out for you, playing 3 Terror Top, 3 Marble Machine, 3 Tekatomborg, and 3 Car Turbo, maxing out on all of those. 2 copies of Colonel Clackers, 1 Speedroid Wing Synchron, 1 Double Yo-Yo, 1 Dendendaiko Duke, and last but certainly not least, 1 copy of Red-Eyed Dice. Now, obviously, maxing out on both Terror Top and Marble Machine is pretty self-explanatory. Same could be said with Tekatomborg. It is by far one of the best, if not the best, extender in the entire archetype, and Car Turbo is definitely right there alongside it. I was originally playing 2, but decided to bump it back up to 3 because it's just one of the best extenders that you can open. I don't mind drawing this card. I even don't mind drawing multiples of it. I can either small world away a copy, or I can discard it off of something like Scratch, right? It's never really a bad card to have in the opening hand, And it, like Tekka Tomborg, is just a very low activation requirement. All we need is a wind monster on the field. And again, I find the hands that I draw this card alongside other combo pieces, I can usually make a better end board. And that graveyard effect does come up quite a bit to boost all of our wins up by 800 attack. Now, Speedroid Colonel Clackers. This is a card I thought myself I wanted to play at 3. No ifs, ands, or buts. And a lot of the lists I've seen online are also playing 3. But I've had a sort of a recent realization that drawing this card is not always super great. In fact, I've had quite a few hands where Colonel Clackers is just sitting there completely dead in my hand because it does have a slightly higher activation requirement than its counterparts here that I'm playing at 3. Now, the only other problem that you could argue you might encounter with playing 2 Colonel Clackers is the lack of follow-up, where you cannot resolve that third copy, because most of the time when you resolve Wing Synchron, you're bringing out other Clackers from the deck, so that's 2 copies out of the deck right away. And if you still have that third copy, you can scale up a Marble Machine, and I honestly don't miss that. It's come up once in a blue moon, and every time that Pendulum Mechanic has come up, it has been extremely lackluster, and it hasn't helped to turn the tide of any of the games that I've been losing, so I don't really think I need or want it in the deck. And if it frees up space for other starter-like cards or non-engine, I think it's perfectly fine to leave this card at 2. And everything else, I think, is perfectly self-explanatory. Duke, Dice, and Yo-Yo are all kind of very situational extenders that we only want in certain points in our combo. Never really want to draw them. Of course, there are times where drawing some of these cards is great, but most of the time, I think we can all agree, they're suboptimal draws, and hence they should be played at 1 copy apiece. Now, let's talk about some other non-Speedroid engine monsters that I'm opting to play. And as you can see here, the only non-Speedroid engine monster that I am opting to play is 1 copy of Mecha Phantom Beast Tetherwolf. Yeah, I like playing this card a lot. I know not everybody's probably playing it, but at the end of the day, a 1-card rubber band shooter is a 1-card rubber band shooter, so I am going to go ahead and choose to play it myself. So that is it for the main decked engine monsters. Let's move into some of the other sort of auxiliary engine cards. And for those sort of auxiliary engine cards, I only have 4. We have 1 copy of Speedroid Wheel, 1 copy of Speedroid Scratch, and 2 copies of Small World. Now, first things first, let's talk about Scratch. Now, when this card first came out, I was extremely reluctant to play it. I thought it was a terrible card. I still don't think it's that great of a card because of its activation requirement. But the fact that we now play Cork Shooter, and we can use that effect to search a Speedroid spell, which can then get us into Colonel Clackers, I think is just too important to not have access to in the main deck, especially since Colonel Clackers is such a pivotal part of most combos nowadays for Speedroid. And we have 1 copy of Wheel. This is a card that I was not playing pretty much at all in most of my testing, but I really wanted to find a way to fit in another starter-like card. I didn't want to play a 3rd copy of Small World. I didn't want to play another normal summon in a Tetherwolf or Hound because of that engine requirement. And while Wheel might have its drawbacks, it's RNG based, it doesn't always guarantee you get into a rubber band shooter because it won't always roll a 3 or higher. It has those drawbacks, like I said, but it's one of the better options we have available. I do not like Win. I think this card is better. If Win was somehow searchable off of Cork Shooter, I'd probably play it over Scratch, but that's obviously not the case, so I am playing Scratch. And Small World is, like I said very early on in the video, synergizes with all of our non-engine. It bridges our non-engine into our non-engine and could probably even go the opposite way around. Then to round out the 40 card main deck, we have a suite of non-engine cards here consisting of 3 Ash Blossom, 2 Nibiru, 2 Molcharmi Perulia, 2 Effect Veiler, 1 Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, 1 Droll Knockbird, 3 Impermanence, 2 Dominus Purge, and 1 Called by the Grave. Now, I know both Perulia and Purge are very expensive cards right now, and if you cannot get your hands on them, you could easily bump up the counts of any other hand traps in the deck, or you could play things like Droplets, you could play more copies of Wheel, what have you. There are other cards you can play. That's it there for the main deck. Now let's take a look at the extra deck. Moving into the extra deck, here we have 2 copies of Rubber Band Shooter, 1 copy of Cork Shooter, 1 copy of Puzzle, 1 copy of Hagoita, 1 High-Speed Roid Glider number 2, 1 copy of Virtual World Juju, 1 copy of the Clearwing Fast Dragon, 2 copies of Clearwing Synchro Dragon, 1 Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, 1 Crystal Clear Wing Synchro Dragon, 1 High-Speed Roid Clearwing Rider, and 2 copies of Crystal Clearwing Over Synchro Dragon. The extra deck, I spent quite a bit of time going back and forth on certain ratios. For the longest time, I was playing 1 Rubber Band Shooter and 1 Win the Wind Charmer Verdant. The reason I was playing that is because I figured if everybody was playing Molcharmy Fulas, it would be a very easy way to turn things like a Nibiru I had and any other Wind monster into Win, take their Molcharmy, and then go into Rubber Band Shooter. That play has come up so little, it's not even funny, and I have greatly missed the second Rubber Band Shooter in terms of the lack of follow-up one has when you don't play it. Puzzle here, the High-Speed Roid Puzzle, is a interesting card choice. I was very iffy on it at first, but the ability to be able to have a level 4 in the extra deck for Rubber Band Shooter to banish reveal both Marble Machine and Colonel Clackers is excellent. While it does not come up a lot, it is so clutch to have in the extra deck, and every time it has come up, it's been clutch. Juju I like a lot as a level 6 option. Obviously you have Raptite and Kendama. I like Juju the most because it helps go into boards, clearing back row, clearing monsters, what have you. Now, High-Speed Roid Clearwing Rider is a sort of newly added card into the extra deck. I wasn't playing it for the longest time. I wasn't sure if I'd ever really want to play it, but you know, a lot of thinking and testing later, I feel like this card deserves a spot in the extra deck. It's a good card to make going first, especially since I'm playing 3 level 7s, so I can easily tag into a Clearwing and a Clearwing Fast if I want to. It's just great mass removal, especially since I'm opting no longer to play Kite Drake, which I think has been one of the more lackluster cards in the extra deck as of late. And the recycling ability it has is also pretty good. You don't always need to make this with like a level 8 and a level 3, which is typically how I've done it in the past. You can use Glider to bring back something like Hagoita, then use Hagoita's effect, make Glider a level 6, and then Hagoita effect just summon itself back and Synchro 11 into your Clearwing Rider. And as you saw, I'm not playing Wonder, so I want to have access to as many Omni Negates as possible. And the only way I think I can do that is by playing, again, multiple OSD. So that is it for the extra deck. Really quickly, I'll show you guys the side deck, even though it is kind of just dependent on what is at your locals. I'll just show you really quickly what I'm opting to play. And the side deck is made up of 3 Lancia, those other 2 copies of Droll, 2 Druis Worm, 1 Magnemut, that 3rd Nibiru, 3 Crossout Designator, 2 D-Barrier, and 1 Artifact Sanctum. You guys know how much I hate playing against Malice, so I want as many copies of Lancia as I can get. I'll take 4. D-Barrier is great going first, and having it as a crossout target is also nice. The Drolls are kind of self-explanatory. Same thing with the Nibs. The only card I'm kind of questionable on is the Druis Worm and Magnemut. But yeah, I think having Druis Worms and Magnemuts in the side deck could be a potential good way to fight off that Fiendsmith engine, which is obviously just so good. You know, after being away from all this for the past year, I am absolutely thrilled to be back. While things may not have gone as I hoped they would with Speedroid, I still had a lot of fun playing and building the deck into what it is today. I also forgot how amazing it is to work on video projects like this one. In fact, I spent nearly 3 weeks on this video and enjoyed every second of it. As I move forward, I hope the Speedroid community will continue to evolve and make the strategy better as a whole. While I may be putting Speedroid aside for the time being, I will no doubt return to it in the future, especially if it can get some help from the ban list. I know it might be a long shot, but I hope Auroradon will return someday soon. And if it does, I'll be back on the deck in a heartbeat. Now at this point, you're probably asking yourself, what deck am I gonna play next? And I don't blame you, it's a great question. Let's just say we're diving into deeper yet familiar depths. I'll see you guys around.